Professor Allan Brimicombe, you've been working in East London a long time. I wonder if you could say something about the kind of work that you've been doing.
Our work has mostly been to do with the physical and social environment of East London, particularly in relation to regeneration, but looking at things like population change, ethnicities and so on in the East London area. And we were tasked by the Economic and Social Research Council with carrying out the Olympic Games impact studies from 2009 onwards.
Could you tell me something about those studies? What sorts of things were you measuring?
These studies take their base year as 2 years before a city gets awarded the contract. So in London's case, that's from 2003. And we looked at about 76 indicators in the environmental, economic and socio-cultural areas. So right across all areas that one would expect a sustainable games to kind of have some impact. And we have to analyze a time series of data every year to see what changes are occurring in that particular indicator. And I have to add that some of these indicators themselves are baskets of indicators. So if you take health as an indicator that the IOC are interested in, within that there's all sorts of things about life expectancy, mortality, morbidity, what prevalences there are of certain types of diseases and so on.
What do you think the limitations are of, for example, taking 2 years before the Games and looking at something like life expectancy in East London and drawing conclusions about the relative impact of the Olympics in comparison to other things?
Yeah, there are two things here. One is the Olympic development in relation to the rest of London is not so big. Okay, so for the Olympic Games development to have impact on London as a whole, it has to be a fairly large impact. But also one has to consider what is the counterfactual. That is, what would have happened without the Games? Because when we're looking at an effect, we want to establish what is the net effect. In other words, what is the absolute gain from having the Olympics over not having it? So when we look at, for example, the transport infrastructure, much of the improvements that were made for the Olympics were kind of in the plan to happen at some time in the future anyway. But what happened was the Olympics accelerated that investment and we got infrastructure maybe a decade ahead of when we would have had it anyway.
Okay, so moving on to some other indicators, did you look at participation in sport, for example?
Right, participation in sport was not good. Okay, it's one of the Olympic promises which didn't hold out. And if I can give an example of that, the government's initial target was for 1 million people to be engaging in more sport, which was defined as half an hour 3 days a week of sport. And when through surveys that was not going to be achieved, the target was changed so that engaging in sport was just once a week instead of 3 times a week. And then, hey presto, there were 1.5 million extra people engaging in sport. But taking the net effect, one has to look at the population growth during that period. And that population growth would have added 900,000 more people doing sport anyway. So the Olympic effect is only 600,000 people and they still hadn't met their target.
You looked at economic impact. Could you tell me something about that?
I think most of the economic impact for the Olympics will come from the infrastructure development that took place. The land agglomeration, so that development could take place on what was previously a split up brownfield site, so that kind of larger, more integrated plans of development could take place. Then there was the infrastructure, the transport infrastructure developments that took place. So new branches of the Docklands Light Rail, the upgrading of the overground, particularly around North London there. This has given the Stratford area much more connectivity with the rest of London and even with southeast England. And it has an international station if only trains would stop there. So theoretically, this area of London could have a reach onto the continent. So that will have an economic impact. Land prices have been going up. And whilst the planners always feel that increasing land prices is a good sign because there's demand to be there in that area of London, it's a double-edged sword because it increases rental prices and people then can't afford the rents, and we get a new kind of gentrification with people moving in and existing populations having to move out. So a double-edged sword there, but by and large there was, prior to the Games, a large area of East London which was not in good economic productive use, and the stage has been set for a much better, more productive use of the land, which should impact on the economy. But we're looking here at a kind of 30-year program actually before it's all fully panned out.
Can I ask you a question there? Because the land was in use, there was land,
Yes.
there were jobs, there were 6,000 jobs.
Yes.
We've lost those jobs. My
Yes.
understanding is that we're nowhere near even meeting that in terms of the jobs replaced so far. So where does your modelling fit there? How do you kind of incorporate that?
Well, in any kind of development like this, there are winners and there are losers, and unfortunately, there nearly always are some losers. Some of the companies that were moved out to new sites, such as near the University of East London, have thrived well. But other businesses decided that was it, and they're not kind of continuing because maybe the compensation package was quite a good one. So companies made their individual decisions, businesses made their individual decisions about what they were going to do post the compulsory purchase of the land and the compensation for having to move off it. But if we consider that this area of land is pretty much the same distance from the centre of London as South Kensington is, and one looks at South Kensington started off with a big mega event, which was the Great Exhibition, yes, in the Crystal Palace. And that generated a cultural centre, which was the Victoria and Albert Museum and the other museums in that area, educational opportunities, which was Imperial College, and we've had both residential and commercial development. Now, it's been a long time since the Victorian era, but that happened as a consequence of a single mega event in that area. And we've got the same thing in East London now, so I think time will tell, but it has the prospect of having a far better economy. If we consider what was the Press and Media Centre, yes, which as a building has provided very good opportunities because of its infrastructure, its fibre connectivity, guaranteed electricity supply and so on, is a good place for media and IT startups and that kind of thing. So whereas it's not creating jobs in the sense of employers employing people, but people being self-employed and having the possibilities of pursuing their dreams, yes, then the Olympics has provided that kind of opportunity.
Can you give me any other opportunities that have been generated on the park?
Well, there is the service sector. I mean, Westfield, although that was started in conjunction with the Olympic development and was possible because some of the land agglomeration and the undergrounding of the electrical overhead cables and so on, that development persisted through the recession because the Olympics were coming to the area, and is now a very large employer in East London. But it's all retail sector. It's probably a lot of minimum wage type work, but is nevertheless employment. And I think when some of the other business sectors of the Olympic Park take off, sure, a lot of the jobs will be imported in and not necessarily taken over by the local population, but I think there will still be a fairly large service component that will be taken up by the local population. But can I just say, whilst everybody seems to be expecting that the Olympic site will generate employment and jobs, the connectivity, the transport connectivity that East London now has through Stratford means that actually people in East London have far better chances of working anywhere in London and not just in East London.
Thank you. East London has been changing. There's been lots of regeneration, and we've got London Docklands, started nearly 40 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at London Docklands, we see that it's created lots of physical regeneration, but the local population somehow were not included in that.
Yeah.
So unemployment levels remained high despite that.
Yes.
Are we going to see a different story in Stratford?
The classic story of development that doesn't trickle down is the Canary Wharf one, where we have this kind of gulf, if you like, move across from Canary Wharf, move across the A13, and you still end up in very deprived areas next to what is essentially the second business district of London. So will the Olympic area have this kind of effect? I think to a much lesser extent, because of the types of housing developments that are taking place in the Olympic site, which have, at the moment, it's been 30 to 35% affordable housing. The new mayor has said he wants to see 50% affordable housing. So that means more of the local population should be able to take advantage of living in that area, whereas over at Canary Wharf, a lot of the living space is very exclusive and rather high private rental. Also, the way in which the London Legacy Development Corporation have tried to stitch the Olympic development into the surrounding areas so that it's not an island unto itself, but has got good access in, out and through, so that it's something which people living on the periphery can engage with rather than being separated from.
I want to talk to you a bit more about housing and what your findings were. Did you have any key housing indicators as part of your Olympic Games impact study?
Well, we had to look at land prices and rental index. All that is going up very substantially. Was going up before the Olympic development started. So this is a London-wide phenomenon rather than something which is exacerbated necessarily by the Olympics. But, you know, there's been a lot of development in the Stratford area, which is not necessarily the kind of traditional housing that or conventional housing that we might think about. There's a lot of student accommodation, for example, so that universities in London that had not very good or not very much student accommodation, there are now these developments which provide that. There's been a lot of development around the periphery of housing and office and hotels and things like that. So all of this is making the area much more attractive to live in, but because London is London, that comes at a premium, and whether people who originally looked to East London as a way into the London economy, because there are a lot of people who come into the London economy, even over the centuries. Okay, if we go back to Jewish migration, Irish migration, Huguenot migration, Caribbean migration, you know, South Asian migration, and so on, into the area, and now East European migration in there, they are essentially looking for low-cost housing as far into London as possible. Because whereas better paid people can trade a travel cost for a housing cost, in other words, if you move further out of London, you can find cheaper housing, but then you've got a travel cost associated with that to come into London, yes. Many of these new entrants into the London economy can't do that. Their wage is a bare minimum kind of living wage, and therefore, whilst they might want to find cheaper, better accommodation, they can't afford the transport cost as well. So London runs the risk that you have nowhere where these new entrants into the economy can actually come into London, because everywhere is equally unaffordable. And what that does in the longer term is you know, to be conjectured at the moment, but from my point of view, it doesn't look so good.
I wanted to ask you a bit more on the housing, and you've been doing stuff on demographic change.
Yeah.
Do you have any evidence on the ethnic composition and how that might be changing in East London and London?
In East London, we've seen with the new accession states in the EU, we've had an influx of East Europeans coming into East London. That is for sure. But the pattern has always been in London, you know, that you get new waves of new entrants into the economy, and those that were previously there displaced gradually outwards, and this has been going on for decades and decades with different groups. So it's just a continuation of that pattern, really.
I suppose one of the things, as you say, that has been an ongoing process, but whether that movement out is now forced rather than choice, because there was always an idea that it would be nicer to live in the suburbs. As East London becomes a nicer place to live, the concern is that maybe people on low incomes just can't afford to live there, so they are the ones displaced.
Well, yes, that was part of my previous point, that people who are on low incomes, who had a place in East London to go because there was affordable rents and so on, start to have nowhere to go, and therefore can't enter into the economy in the first place. It becomes prohibitive.
And even in terms of the rents, as you said, we've looked at rents, we've seen an increase in rents.
Yes.
Now, housing, even affordable housing, is linked to market rents.
That's right.
And this has created a real problem, I think, for genuinely affordable housing on the park.
I think the whole of London is becoming equally unaffordable, and that starts to be problematic for the London economy as a whole.
What do you think we can learn from London? What have we done well here and what have we done less well?
Well, we didn't do well in terms of trying to get people to do more sport and have healthier lifestyles. But that was always going to be a generational thing. You can't change lifestyles kind of in a matter of a few years. It's going to be a generational thing. But we're still seeing in East London, for example, rising obesity in primary school children. So the messages there aren't really getting through. Also, something else that the government missed an opportunity was through the volunteering. 700,000 volunteers, the games makers, they loved it. It could have been that, these volunteers could have found other volunteering opportunities if pointed in the right direction or the opportunities were made available to them. But because there was this hiatus over, can we release the database to other organisations because it contains their personal data and all the rest, the opportunity was missed to kind of harness more long-term the volunteering enthusiasm that there had been, and that could have been fed back into sporting opportunities, part of opening up clubs in schools and so on and so forth always requires volunteers and so on to help. So that wasn't so well done. In terms of opportunities for disabled people, the figures show that in East London the employment rate amongst disabled people has been going up faster than the rest of London and the rest of the country. So I think that has had an impact there. Other things well done, I think the acceleration of the upgrade of the transport network, which was not just around the Olympics, but also across London generally. I think that will pay dividends in the longer term. But yes, there are benefits, but there are some things which didn't work so well. Well, it was to regenerate the heart of East London, and East London. The heart of East London was never very well defined. Now, it's come to mean the Olympic site, yes, as being the heart of East London, which is a shame, really, because East London is far bigger than the Olympic site, and to regenerate a much wider area. But, as a catalyst, to further development, providing the investments can be made, should, as we've said, trickle out. But some critics would say that it's taken money away from other projects that could have been done. So whilst there was nice connectivity, transport connectivity put into Stratford, Barking Riverside, which is potentially a huge development area for housing, etc., still has nothing of that type going in there. And until it does, until there's a DLR extension or an underground extension or an overrail extension into that area, nothing much will happen because people don't have the means to easily travel in and out and connect with jobs and shopping and social and recreational activities and so on.
I just wanted to ask you a question about the mega event as a vehicle for regeneration. What do you think are the advantages and the disadvantages of using a mega event?
Right. A mega event can accelerate transformation, whether that is in terms of the infrastructure of a city or a social transformation, so that things that would have otherwise just kind of plodded along in the yearly round of planning and tax and spend and build, here is an opportunity to get it fixed quick because there's a deadline and the show has to go on, and whether it's the Olympics or Formula One or some other kind of event that is large in terms of the size of the city itself, it is a model which I think is one that can be worked to the advantage. However, However, it requires a large amount of investment. In other words, the money that you might have spent drip, drip, drip over 20, 30 years now has to be spent in a 10-year period. So you have to have the ability to gain those finances and also bring the population along with you, that this is what you're going to spend on now, and other things are going to take a back seat. And so therefore it's important that the population understands what's going on and why it's going on. The legacy has to be built into the plan from when you start thinking about the mega event. It should never be an afterthought. If it's an afterthought, it'll never happen. So it has to, you have to start off by saying, what do we want to achieve in terms of transformation for our city from this event? And therefore, how do we plan to stage this event and achieve what we want? Yes. So Rome, for example, is bidding for the 2024 Games. Okay. What they want to achieve, for example, is the London equivalent of a Circle Line, which they don't have. Okay. They've got most of the venues already there. It's not a case of, we need a world-class velodrome or a world-class Olympic swimming pool. They've already got those, yes. So they've got other objectives in terms of what they want to achieve by investing in producing an Olympic Games.
Do you think we had the right mechanisms in place when we won the bid? Had we actually thought through legacy and how we were going to achieve it?
I think we did, because in our bid we said we were going to be the most sustainable games. Now that implies that it's not just a period of 10 years while you're doing the games, preparing and then staging the show. It's for long periods afterwards, and that legacy was in there from maybe not in terms of the fine detail, but in the broad picture on the canvas. A legacy for East London, a sporting legacy, inspiring a generation were already in there.
Had we thought sufficiently about the regeneration of East London?
Well, regeneration's been going on in London for an awful long time, yes, and nothing much had budged because of the regeneration, in my view. Okay, there's still high levels of deprivation, high levels of unemployment, and so on in East London. So either the games were a last desperation or a bit of a stroke of genius in order to try and say, well, we can perhaps have a catalyst for trying to solve this in a much more impactful way than had previously been done.
You mentioned indexes of multiple deprivation, and there's been some change in East London. How do you account for that change?
Well, the change has shown that in terms of the index of multiple deprivation, East London is less deprived than it was. Okay, the index is made up of all sorts of different dimensions to do with health and employment and so on. And it may reflect a gentrification of the area, or it may just reflect trends and improvements that had been set in place by the various regeneration projects and the Olympics. Finally kind of registering within the index that things were getting better. What it does mean that relatively some areas in the country are doing worse, and attention might have to shift.